The slums of Victorian London were home to some of the poorest communities in the metropolis. Poorly constructed, overcrowded housing was characterised by gloomy, narrow streets and alleyways frequented by criminals and prostitutes. They took on the no doubt unwelcome to those whose home it was sobriquet of Rookery. This mocking the rook, being a bird that habitually nests in large colonies crammed into noisy treetops. The main streets of these rookeries and urban poverty are evocative of 19th century dystopia for us today for good reason. They are often caricatured and mysterious places where journalists and cartographers feared to tread. But there were social commentators who sought to walk amongst the poor and highlight their lives and living conditions by publishing what they saw and heard. One such journalist was Henry Mayhew, who went into great detail concerning lower-class life. In 1860 he visited the slum of St. Giles, which included 7 dials. In the 18th century, 7 Dials was constructed as a respectable neighbourhood, envisaged as the new Covent Garden piazza, but early in the next century fell into decline. Its character deteriorated into an overcrowded warren of dark alleyways. It became infamous for its urban poverty. Both Charles Dickens and John Keats commented on its dirty streets, being a last resort for the poor and ill. These are the streets into which Mayhew ventured so he could observe and document the wretched lives of its inhabitants. In this video, you will hear the description of a whole range of characters he met in its pubs and lodging houses, from the hard-working lower classes to thieves and prostitutes. These are the slum dwellers you would meet on a visit to 7 Dials. Before we start, please consider clicking the subscribe button in the bottom right of your screen for more content like this. If you find this video interesting, I would really appreciate it if you could give it a thumbs up and share it widely with friends and family. These 2 things really do show your support and help the channel grow so I can bring you more. Thank you. Check out the description for links to more interesting videos about the Victorians, and take a look at the channel page for even more content. In company with a police officer, we proceeded to the 7 Dials, one of the most remarkable localities in London, inhabited by bird fanciers, keepers of stores of old clothes and old shoes, costermongers, patterers, and a motley assemblage of others, chiefly of the lower classes. As we stood at one of the angles in the centre of the Dials, we saw 3 young men, burglars, loitering at an opposite corner of an adjoining dial. One of them had a gentlemanly appearance, and was dressed in superfine black cloth and beaver hat. The other 2 were attired as mechanics or tradesmen. One of them had recently returned from penal servitude, and another had undergone a long imprisonment. Leaving the 7 Dials and its dingy neighbourhood, we went to Oxford Street, one of the first commercial streets in London, and one of the finest in the world. It reminded us a good deal of the celebrated Broadway, New York, although the buildings of the latter are in some places more costly and splendid, and some of the shops more magnificent. Oxford Street is one of the main streets of London, and is ever resounding with a din of vehicles, carts, cabs, hansoms, brooms, and omnibuses driving along. Many of the shops are spacious and crowded with costly goods, and the large windows of plate glass, set in massive brass frames, are gaily furnished with their various articles of merchandise. On the opposite side of the street, we observed a jolly, comfortable-looking elderly man, like a farmer in appearance, not at all like a London sharper. He was standing looking along the street as though he were waiting for someone. He was a magsman, a skittle sharp, and no doubt other members of the gang were hovering near. He appeared to be as cunning as an old fox in his movements, admirably fitted to entrap the unwary. A little farther along the street we saw a fashionably dressed man coming towards us, arm in arm with his companion, among the throng of people. They were in the prime of life, and had a respectable and even opulent appearance. One of them was good-humoured and social, as though he were on good terms with himself and society in general. The other was more callous and reserved, and more suspicious in his aspect. Both were bedecked with glittering watch chains and gold rings. They passed by a few paces, when the more social of the two, looking over his shoulder, met our eye, directed towards him, turned back and accosted us, and was even so generous as to invite us into a gin palace nearby, which we courteously declined. The two magsmen, card sharpers, strutted off like fine gentlemen along the street on the outlook for their victims. Here we saw another young man, a burglar, pass by. He had an engaging appearance and was very tasteful in his dress, very unlike the rough burglars we met at Whitechapel, the Borough and Lambeth. Leaving Oxford Street, we went along Holborn to Chancery Lane, chiefly frequented by barristers and attorneys, and entered Fleet Street, one of the main arteries of the metropolis, reminding us of London in the olden feudal times, when the streets were crowded together in dense masses, flanked with innumerable dingy alleys, courts, and by-streets, like a great rabbit warren. Fleet Street, though a narrow business street with its traffic often choked with vehicles, is interesting from its antique historical and literary associations. Elbowing our way through the throng of people, we passed through one of the gloomy arches of Temple Bar, and issued into the Strand, where we saw two pickpockets, young, tall, gentlemanly men, cross the street from St. Clement's Church and enter a restaurant. They were attired in a suit of superfine black cloth, cut in fashionable style. They entered an elegant dining room and probably sat down to costly viands and wines. Leaving the Strand, we went up St. Martin's Lane, a narrow street leading from the Strand to the Seven Dials. We here saw a young man, an expert burglar of about 24 years of age and swarthy complexion, standing at the corner of the street. He was well dressed, in a dark cloth suit, with a billycock hat. One of his comrades was taken from his side about 3 weeks ago on a charge of burglary. Entering a beer shop in the neighbourhood of St. Giles, close by the Seven Dials, we saw a band of coiners and ringers of changes. One of them, a genteel-looking, slim youth, is a notorious coiner and has been convicted. He was sitting quietly by the door over a glass of beer, with his companion by his side. One of them is a moulder, another was sentenced to 10 years penal servitude for coining and selling base coin. A modest-looking young man, one of the gang, was seated by the bar, also respectably dressed. He is generally supposed to be a subordinate connected with this coining band, looking out while they are coining, that no officers of justice are near, and carrying the bag of base money for them when they go out to sell it to base wretches in small quantities at low prices. 5 shillings worth of base money is generally sold for 10p. Ringing the changes is effected in this way. A person offers a good sovereign to a shopkeeper to be changed. The gold piece is chinked on the counter, or otherwise tested, and is proved to be good. The man hastily asks back and gets the sovereign, and pretends that he has some silver, so that he does not require to change it. On feeling his pocket, he finds he does not have it, and returns a base piece of money resembling it, instead of the genuine gold piece. We returned to Bow Street and saw 3 young pickpockets proceeding along in company, like 3 well-dressed costermongers in dark cloth frock coats and caps. Being desirous of having a more thorough knowledge of the people residing in the Rookery of St. Giles, we visited it with Mr. Hunt, Inspector of Police. We first went to a lodging house in George Street, Oxford Street, called the Hampshire Hog Yard. Most of the lodgers were then out. On visiting a room in the garret, we saw a man, in mature years, making artificial flowers. He appeared to be very ingenious, and made several roses before us with marvellous rapidity. He had suspended along the ceiling bundles of dyed grasses of various hues, crimson, yellow, green, brown, and other colours, to furnish cases of stuffed birds. He was a very intelligent man and a natural genius. He told us strong drink had brought him to this humble position in the garret, and that he once had the opportunity of making a fortune in the service of a nobleman. We felt, as we looked on his countenance and listened to his conversation, he was capable of moving in a higher sphere of life. Yet he was wonderfully contented with his humble lot. We visited Dyot House, George Street, the ancient manor house of St. Giles in the Fields, now fitted up as a lodging house for simple men. The kitchen, an apartment about 15 feet square, is surrounded with massive and tasteful panelling in the olden style. A large fire blazing in the grate, with 2 boilers on each side, was kept burning night and day to supply the lodgers with hot water for their tea and coffee. Some rashers of bacon were suspended before the fire, with a plate underneath. There was a gas light in the centre of the apartment and a dial on the back wall. The kitchen was furnished with 2 long deal tables and a dresser, with forms to serve as seats. There were about 15 labouring men present, most of them busy at supper on fish and bread and tea. They were a very mixed company, such as we would expect at a London lodging house. Men working in cab yards, assisting cabmen, some distributing bills in the streets, one man carrying advertising boards, and others jobbing at anything they can find to do in the neighbourhood. This house was clean and comfortable, and had the appearance of being a truly comfortable poor man's home. It was cheerful to look around us and see the social air of the inmates. One man sat with coat off, enjoying the warmth of the kitchen. A boy was at his tea, cutting up dried fish and discussing his bread and butter. A young man of about 19 sat at the back of the apartment with a very sinister countenance, very unlike the others. There was something about him that indicated a troubled mind. We also observed a number of elderly men among the party, some in jackets and others in velvet coats, with an honest look about them. When the house was a brothel about 15 years ago, an unfortunate prostitute named Mary Brothers was murdered in this kitchen by a man named Connell, who was afterwards executed at Newgate for the deed. He had carnal connection with this woman some time before, and as he suspected that she had communicated to him the venereal disease with which he was afflicted, in revenge he took her life, having purchased a knife at a neighbouring cutler's shop. Leaving George Street, we passed on to Church Lane, a by-street in the rear of New Oxford Street, containing 28 houses. It was dark as we passed along. We saw the street lamps lighted in Oxford Street, and the shop windows brilliantly illuminated, while the thunder of vehicles in the street broke on our ear, rolling in a perpetual stream. Here, a very curious scene presented itself to our view. From the windows of the 3-storied houses in Church Lane were suspended wooden rods with clothes to dry across the narrow streets. Cotton gowns, sheets, trousers, drawers, and vests, some ragged and patched, and others old and faded, giving a more picturesque aspect to the scene, which was enhanced by the dim lights in the windows and the groups of the lower orders of all ages assembled below, clustered around the doorways and in front of the houses, or indulging in merriment in the street. Altogether, the appearance of the inhabitants was much more clean and orderly than might be expected in such a low locality. Many women of the lower orders, chiefly of the Irish cockneys, were seated, crouching with their knees almost touching their chin beside the open windows. Some men were smoking their pipes as they stood leaning against the walls of their houses, whom from their appearance we took to be evidently outdoor labourers. Another labouring man was seated on the side of his window in corduroy trousers, light grey coat and cap, with an honest look of good humour and industry. Numbers of young women, the wives of costermongers, sat in front of their houses in the manner we have described, clad in cotton gowns, with a general aspect of personal cleanliness and contentment. At the corners of the streets and at many of the doorways were groups of young costermongers who had finished their hard day's work and were contentedly chatting and smoking. They generally stood with their hands in their breeches pockets. Most of these people are Irish, or the children of Irish parents. The darkness of the street was lighted up by the street lamps as well as by the lights in the windows of 2 chandlers' shops and 1 public house. At one of the chandlers' shop, the proprietor was standing by his door with folded arms as he looked good-humouredly on his neighbours around his shop door. We also saw some of the young street urchins, bareheaded, and barefooted, with their little hands in their pockets, or squatted on the street, having the usual restless, artful look peculiar to their tribe. Here a house was pointed out to us, number 21, which was formerly let at a rent of £25 per annum to a publican that resided in the neighbourhood. He let the same rooms for £90 a year, and these again received from parties residing in them upwards of £120. The house is still let in rooms, but they are occupied, like all others in the neighbourhood, by one family only. At one house as we passed along we saw a woman selling potatoes at the window to persons in the street. On looking into the interior we saw a cheerful fire burning in the grate and some women sitting around it. We also observed several bushel baskets and sacks placed round the room, filled with potatoes, of which they sell a large quantity. In Church Lane we found lodging houses, the kitchens of which are entered from the street by a descent of a few steps leading underground to the basement. Here we found numbers of people clustered together around several tables, some reading the newspapers, others supping on fish, bread, tea, and potatoes, and some lying half asleep on the tables in all imaginable positions. These, we were told, had just returned from hopping in Kent and had walked long distances and were fatigued. On entering some of these kitchens, the ceiling being very low, we found a large fire burning in the grate and a general air of comfort, cleanliness, and order. Such scenes as these were very homely and picturesque, and reminded us very forcibly of localities of London in the olden time. In some of them, the inmates were only half-dressed, and yet appeared to be very comfortable from the warmth of the apartment. Here we saw a number of the poorest imbeciles we had noticed in the course of our rambles through the great metropolis. Many of them were middle-aged men, others more elderly, very shabbily dressed, and some half-naked. There was little manliness left in the poor wretches as they squatted drearily on the benches. The inspector told us they were chiefly vagrants, and were sunk in profound ignorance and debasement, from which they were utterly unable to rise. The next kitchen of this description we entered was occupied by females. It was about 15 feet square, and belonged to a house of 10 rooms, part of which was occupied as a low lodging house. Here we found 5 women seated around a table, most of them young, but one more advanced in life. Some of them were good-looking, as though they had been respectable servants. They were busy at their tea, bread, and butcher's meat. On the table stood a candle on a small candlestick. They sat in curious positions round the table, some of them with an ample crinoline. One sat by the fire with her gown drawn over her knees, displaying her white petticoat. As we stood beside them, they burst out in a titter which they could not suppress. On looking round, we observed a plate rack at the back of the kitchen, and, as usual in these lodging houses, a glorious fire burning brightly in the grate. An old chest of drawers, surmounted with shelves, stood against the wall. The girls were all prostitutes or thieves, but had no appearance of shame. They were apparently very merry. The old woman sat very thoughtfully, looking observant on, and no doubt wondering what errand could have brought us into the house. We then entered another dwelling house. On looking down the stairs we saw a company of young women, from 17 to 25 years of age. A rope was hung over the fireplace, with stockings and shirts suspended over it, and clothes were drying on a screen. A young woman, with her hair netted and ornamented, sat beside the fire with a green jacket and striped petticoat with crinoline. Another good-looking young woman sat by the table dressed in a cotton gown and striped apron, with coffee-pot in hand and teacups before her. Some pleasant-looking girls sat by the table with their chins leaning on their hands, smiling cheerfully, looking at us with curiosity. Another coarser, featured dame lolled by the end of the table, with her gown drawn over her head, smirking in our countenance, and one sat by, her shawl drawn over her head. Another, apparently modest girl, sat by, cutting her nails with a knife. On the walls around the apartment were suspended a goodly assortment of bonnets, cloaks, gowns, and petticoats. Meantime, an elderly little man came in with a cap on his head and a long staff in his hand, and stood looking on with curiosity. On the table lay a pack of cards beside the bowls, cups and other crockery ware. Some of the girls appeared as if they had lately been servants in respectable situations, and one was like a quiet, genteel shop girl. They were all prostitutes, and most of them prowl about at night to plunder drunken men. As we looked on, the more interesting girls, especially two of them, we saw the sad consequences of one wrong step, which may launch the young and thoughtless into a criminal career and drive them into the dismal companionship of the most lewd and debased. We then went to Short's Gardens and entered a house there. In the basement underground we saw a company of men, women, and children of various ages, seated around the tables and by the fire. The men and women had mostly been engaged in hopping, and appeared to be healthy, industrious, and orderly. Until lately, thieves used to lodge in these premises. As we entered Queen Street, we saw 3 thieves, lads of about 14 years of age, standing in the middle of the street as if on the outlook for booty. They were dressed in black frock coats, corduroy, and fustian trousers, and black caps. Passing along Queen Street, which is one of the wings of the Dials, we went up the central space between the 7 dials. Here, a very lively scene presented itself to our view. Clusters of labouring men and a few men of doubtful character in dark, shabby dress loitered by the corners of the surrounding streets. We also saw groups of elderly women standing at some of the angles, most of them ragged and drunken, their very countenances the pictures of abject misery. The numerous public houses in the locality were driving a busy traffic and were thronged with motley groups of people of various grades, from the respectable merchant and tradesman to the thief and the beggar. Bands of boys and girls were gambling in the street in wild frolic, tumbling on their head with their heels in the air, and shouting in merriment, while the policeman was quietly looking on in good humour. Around the centre of the Dials were bakers' shops with large illuminated fronts, the shelves being covered with loaves and the baker busy attending to his customers. In the window was a large printed notice advertising the best wheaten bread at 6d. a loaf. A druggist's shop was invitingly adorned with beautiful green and purple jars, but no customers entered during the time of our stay. At the corner of an opposite dial was an old clothes store with a large assortment of second-hand garments, chiefly for men of various kinds, qualities and styles, suspended around the front of the shop. There were also provision shops, which were well attended with the customers. The whole neighbourhood presented an appearance of bustle and animation, and omnibuses and other vehicles were passing along in a perpetual stream. The most of the low girls in this locality do not go out till late in the evening, and chiefly devote their attention to drunken men. They frequent the principal thoroughfares in the vicinity of Oxford Street, Holborn, Farringdon Street, and other bustling streets. From the nature of their work, they are of a migratory character. The most of the men we saw in the houses we visited belonged to the labouring class. Men employed to assist in cleaning cabs and omnibuses, carriers of advertising boards, distributors of bills, patterers, chickweed sellers, ballad singers, and persons generally of industrious character. They are willing to work, but will steal rather than want. The lodging-house people here have not been known of late years to receive stolen property, and the inhabitants generally are steadily rising in habits of decency, cleanliness, and morality.